What's up, everyone? Tonight, you're about to discover how Victorian London literally stank its way into modern civilization. Imagine stepping off a train at London Bridge in 1858, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of bustling crowds or the sound of horse-drawn carriages. It's the smell. A thick, nauseating wave of human waste, rotting garbage, and industrial chemicals that makes your eyes water and your stomach lurch. You probably wouldn't survive this. The air itself seems to have weight, pressing down on you like a damp, fetid blanket that clings to your clothes and follows you wherever you go. So before you get comfortable, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your city and the current time. I love seeing where our community spans across the globe. You're standing in the middle of what historians call the Great Stink, and it's about to change everything. The Thames beside you isn't the romantic waterway you might imagine for period dramas. Instead, it's a slow-moving river of sewage, dark brown and thick as chocolate pudding, carrying the waste of nearly 3 million people directly past the Houses of Parliament. The irony is delicious. The very politicians who've ignored this crisis for decades are now forced to soak handkerchiefs in lime and press them to their faces just to breathe during sessions. Now turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background sound, and let's begin our journey tonight. You find yourself walking through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, where the smell grows even more intense. Here, families of 8 or 10 people share single rooms, and their only toilet facility is a communal cesspit shared with dozens of neighbors. The pit overflows regularly, sending streams of waste trickling down cobblestone streets like grotesque urban rivers. Children play hopscotch over these streams, their bare feet splashing through puddles that shimmer with an oily, unnatural rainbow. The Victorian obsession with moral cleanliness stands in stark contrast to this physical squalor. While preachers thunder about the importance of spiritual purity, raw sewage flows directly beneath their church floors. You can smell it even now, seeping up through floorboards during Sunday services, mixing the sacred with the profane in ways that would make even the most devout Victorian blush. As you continue your journey, you notice how the wealthy neighborhoods attempt to distance themselves from the stench. In Belgravia and Mayfair, servants burn expensive incense and scatter rose petals to mask the smell that drifts in through open windows. The rich haven't escaped the Great Stink. They've simply found more expensive ways to pretend it doesn't exist. Some wealthy families actually move to the countryside during summer months, calling it a health retreat, when really they're just fleeing their own city's bowel movements. You witness the daily routine of the night soil men, who collect human waste from cesspits and privies under cover of darkness. These men wade through waste up to their knees, using long-handled ladles to scoop excrement into wooden carts. The job pays well precisely because it's so revolting, 3 times the wage of a factory worker. Yet even these hardy souls sometimes succumb to the toxic gases, collapsing into the very waste they're trying to remove. The Thames itself tells the most damning story of Victorian hypocrisy. By day, gentlemen in top hats and ladies in crinolines promenade along its banks, discussing the latest moral philosophy or debating the virtues of Christian charity. By night, these same banks receive the contents of thousands of chamber pots, turning the river into London's collective toilet bowl. The contrast between public righteousness and private necessity creates a cognitive dissonance that defines the entire era. Dr. John Snow, a physician you encounter near Broad Street, has been arguing for years that cholera spreads through contaminated water, not bad air, as the medical establishment insists. His colleagues dismiss him as a radical, preferring the miasma theory that blames disease on mysterious vapors. Historians still debate whether Snow's insights could have prevented thousands of deaths if the medical community hadn't been so invested in their existing theories. You observe the construction of Joseph Bazalgette's revolutionary sewer system beginning to take shape beneath your feet. Workers tunnel through clay and gravel, creating an underground network that will eventually span 1,100 miles. The engineering marvel requires precise calculations of gradient and flow, ensuring that gravity carries waste away from the city center toward treatment works downstream. Yet even this solution reflects Victorian prejudices. The sewers are designed to dump treated waste into the Thames, but far enough downstream that it becomes someone else's problem. The social implications ripple through every level of society. Wealthy families hire sewer rats, young boys who crawl through the narrow brick tunnels to clear blockages and retrieve valuable items that fall through grates. These children, some as young as 6, navigate an underground labyrinth where methane gas can explode without warning and cave-ins happen regularly. Their small size makes them perfect for the job, but their mortality rate rivals that of coal miners. Parliament's response to the crisis reveals the era's essential hypocrisy. The same legislators who pass laws about public morality and social responsibility initially refuse to fund sewer construction, calling it an unnecessary expense. Only when the stench becomes so overwhelming that MPs can't function in their chambers do they finally allocate resources. The Great Stink forces their hand in ways that human suffering never could, a perfect metaphor for Victorian priorities. As summer intensifies, you feel the heat radiating off the pavement, baking the waste-soaked streets until the city becomes a giant outdoor oven. The smell grows so intense that people vomit in the streets, adding to the general mess. Newspapers describe citizens fleeing London in such numbers that property values plummet. The city that prides itself on being the center of a global empire can't manage its own excrement. You find yourself standing in a dimly lit Victorian parlor, with a heavy scent of lilies mingles with a metallic smell of photographic chemicals. The room feels hushed, almost sacred, but there's something unsettling about the silence. Your eyes adjust to the amber glow filtering through thick velvet curtains, and you notice a family gathered around what appears to be a sleeping child. Except the child isn't sleeping, and this isn't a bedtime story in the way you might expect. Welcome to the strange world of Victorian death photography, where families pose with their deceased loved ones as naturally as you might pose with your living relatives today. The practice seems macabre to modern sensibilities, but in an era when photography was expensive and death was commonplace, these portraits often represented the only visual record a family would ever have of their departed. You probably think your family's holiday photos are awkward, but at least everyone's breathing. You watch as the photographer, a somber man in black wool, adjusts his large format camera with mechanical precision. His movements are practiced, almost ritualistic, as he positions the deceased child in a chair, propping the small body with hidden supports to create the illusion of life. The child's eyes have been painted open on the closed lids, a technique that creates an eerie semblance of awareness. Glass eyes were sometimes inserted for a more lifelike appearance, though the results often fell squarely into what you'd now call the uncanny valley. The family waits patiently as the photographer prepares his plates. Mother sits rigid in her best black dress, her face a mask of controlled grief. Father stands behind her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, the other clutching a pocket watch, a symbol of time stopped forever. The living siblings gather around their dead brother or sister, some looking directly at the camera with expressions that seem to contain entire lifetimes of sorrow. This mainstream practice of memento mori photography served both practical and emotional purposes in Victorian society. With infant mortality rates hovering around 150 deaths per 1,000 births, death was an intimate companion in every household. Families couldn't afford the luxury of denial that modern medicine has granted us. Death photography became a way to assert that a life, however brief, had mattered, that this person had existed and deserved to be remembered. You notice how the photographer carefully arranges flowers around the scene. Lilies for purity, roses for love, forget-me-nots for remembrance. Each bloom carries symbolic weight in the elaborate Victorian language of flowers. The deceased child holds a single white rose, its petals beginning to brown at the edges, a subtle reminder that even symbols of purity and innocence are subject to decay. The exposure takes several minutes, during which the living family members must remain absolutely still. You can see the strain in their faces, the trembling in their hands as they fight to maintain composure. One slight movement would blur the image, ruining what might be their last chance to preserve this moment. The irony is palpable. The dead subject is the only one guaranteed to remain perfectly motionless. As the photographer disappears beneath his dark cloth to focus the camera, you learn about some lesser-known aspects of this peculiar industry. Professional mourning photographers often traveled from town to town, advertising their services in local newspapers alongside announcements for miracle cures and patent medicines. Some developed specialties: infant photography, family groupings, or even post-mortem wedding portraits for couples where one partner died before the ceremony. The most skilled practitioners could make the deceased appear almost alive through careful positioning and lighting. They would wire bodies in unnatural poses, prop open eyelids, and even paint rosy cheeks to simulate the blush of health. The goal wasn't to pretend death hadn't occurred, but to capture the person as they had been in life. A final act of love and remembrance that feels both tender and deeply unsettling. Victorian mourning rituals extended far beyond photography into an elaborate social choreography that governed every aspect of grief. You observe how the mother's dress follows strict mourning protocols. Black crepe for the first year, followed by black silk with modest trimmings, then gradually lighter shades of gray and purple before finally returning to colors after 2 years. Her jewelry is carved from jet or made from the hair of the deceased, worn as tangible connections to those who had passed. Historians still debate whether these elaborate mourning customs helped people process grief or simply prolong their suffering. Some argue that the Victorian approach to death was healthier than modern society's tendency to hide mortality behind hospital walls and funeral parlors. Others suggest that the rigid rules and extended mourning periods trapped people, particularly women, in cycles of perpetual grief that prevented emotional healing. The economics of Victorian death reveal another layer of societal hypocrisy. While the wealthy could afford elaborate mourning wardrobes and professional photography, the poor often had to choose between feeding their living children and properly memorializing their dead. Pauper graves, unmarked and unconsecrated, served as grim reminders that even in death, class distinctions persisted. Yet the same society that condemned the poor for inadequate mourning rituals often exploited the labor that led to their early deaths. You watch as the photographer finally triggers the shutter, capturing this moment of suspended grief for eternity. The chemical reaction on the glass plate preserves not just images but emotions. Love, loss, hope, and despair crystallized in silver and gelatin. These photographs would hang in parlors for generations, creating galleries of the dead that serve as constant reminders of mortality's proximity. The strangest aspect of death photography might be how it reveals the Victorian obsession with appearances extending even beyond life. Families would spend their life savings on elaborate funeral photography while neglecting the living conditions that contributed to high mortality rates. The same parents who couldn't afford proper nutrition or medical care for their children would somehow find money for an ornate death portrait. A tragic testament to the power of social expectations over practical necessity. As the session concludes, you notice how quickly the room returns to the business of living. The photographer packs his equipment with businesslike efficiency, promising to deliver the finished portraits within a week. The family disperses, returning to their daily routines with the peculiar mixture of relief and emptiness that follows any intense ritual. Death photography was, at its core, an attempt to stop time, to hold on as something precious that was slipping away with each passing moment. You hear them before you see them, the soft patter of bare feet on cold stone floors, echoing through the pre-dawn darkness like raindrops on a tin roof. As you follow the sound down a narrow Manchester street, the acrid smell of coal smoke mingles with something else, something that makes your throat tighten. It's the metallic scent of machinery mixed with the sweet, sickly odor of overworked bodies and fear-tinged sweat. The factory looms before you, its windows glowing like amber eyes in the darkness. Steam hisses from various pipes and vents, creating ghostly clouds that drift across the courtyard where dozens of children shuffle toward the entrance. Some are so small they have to crane their necks to reach the door handles. Others move with the mechanical precision of adults, their childhood already ground away by months or years of repetitive labor. You watch a girl who can't be more than 7 years old as she approaches the massive iron gates. Her name is Sarah, though no one bothers to use it here. She's simply number 47 to the overseers. Her tiny fingers are already stained black from handling raw cotton, and you notice how she favors her left leg, probably from standing at the spinning machines for 14 hours yesterday. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. The same society that celebrates childhood innocence in its literature literally feeds children into industrial machines like coal into a furnace. The factory whistle shrieks at exactly 5 in the morning, cutting through the air like a banshee's wail. You feel the sound vibrate in your chest, and you realize this mechanical scream will mark every hour of these children's lives for the next 14 hours. The gates swing open with a grinding metallic screech, and the small army of child workers flows inside, like water, finding the path of least resistance. Inside the textile mill, the noise hits you like a physical force. The constant thundering of power looms creates a rhythmic pounding that you feel in your bones, while the whir of spinning machines adds a high-pitched whine that makes your ears ring. The air is thick with cotton fibers that catch the morning light streaming through grimy windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that belies the harsh reality unfolding beneath. Sarah takes her position at a spinning frame that towers above her like a mechanical giant. Her job is to tie broken threads, a task that requires her to crawl under the moving machinery while it operates. The factory owners prefer children for this work because their small size allows them to navigate the tight spaces between machines. You watch her nimble fingers work with practiced efficiency, knowing that one moment of inattention could result in crushed limbs or worse. The overlooker, a burly man with scarred hands and tobacco-stained teeth, patrols the rows of machines with a leather strap hanging from his belt. Children who work too slowly or make mistakes feel the sharp crack of leather against skin. The sound echoes through the factory floor like sporadic gunfire, each strike a reminder that childhood here is a luxury no one can afford. Honestly, you've probably had gentler wake-up calls from your morning alarm. This mainstream practice of child labor formed the backbone of Britain's Industrial Revolution. By 1850, nearly half of all factory workers were under 18, with children as young as 5 working in textile mills, coal mines, and match factories. Parliament had passed the Factory Act of 1833, supposedly limiting working hours for children, but enforcement was sporadic at best. Factory owners simply shifted schedules or moved operations to avoid inspection, treating legal compliance like an inconvenient game of hide and seek. You notice how the children have developed their own subtle communication system, a series of hand signals and whispered code words that allow them to share information without attracting the overlooker's attention. They warn each other about broken machinery, approaching inspectors, or which overseers are in particularly foul moods. This underground network represents perhaps the only autonomy these young workers can claim in their highly regulated lives. The mill's owner, Mr. Blackwood, occasionally tours his domain wearing a fine wool coat that was probably manufactured by these very children. He speaks earnestly about providing employment opportunities for the poor, claiming that factory work builds character and teaches valuable skills. From his perspective, he's performing a charitable service, rescuing children from the streets and giving them productive labor. The fact that this charity also generates enormous profits is, he insists, merely coincidental. As the morning progresses, you witness the toll this environment takes on developing bodies. Children develop curved spines from bending over machines for hours, while their lungs fill with cotton fibers that will cause respiratory problems for the rest of their lives. Many suffer from mill fever, a condition caused by inhaling organic dust that creates flu-like symptoms. The factory's medical officer, when one exists at all, typically prescribes fresh air and rest, treatments that are impossible for children who spend 14 hours a day in stuffy, dangerous conditions. Historians still debate whether child labor was a necessary evil of industrialization or simply exploitation dressed up as economic progress. Some argue that factory work, however harsh, provided income for desperate families who might otherwise starve. Others maintain that the profits from child labor primarily benefited factory owners and shareholders, while the costs, stunted development, health problems, lost education, were borne entirely by the workers themselves. The lunch break arrives at exactly noon, announced by the same ear-splitting whistle that started the day. Children have 30 minutes to eat whatever food they've brought from home, usually a chunk of bread and perhaps a small piece of cheese if their families are fortunate. You watch Sarah share her meager meal with a younger boy whose parents couldn't afford to pack him lunch. These small acts of kindness shine like candles in the industrial darkness, proof that human compassion survives even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The afternoon brings different challenges as fatigue sets in and attention wavers. This is when most accidents occur, when tired fingers slip or exhausted workers stumble into moving machinery. The factory keeps a ledger of injuries that reads like a catalog of human suffering. Crushed fingers, severed limbs, scalping accidents where long hair gets caught in spinning wheels. The company's response is typically to dock the injured workers' pay for the time lost to recovery, if they survive at all. You observe the complex relationship between child workers and their families. Many parents depend entirely on their children's wages for survival, creating impossible moral dilemmas. Removing a child from factory work might save their health and education, but it could also mean starvation for younger siblings. This economic trap keeps families locked in cycles of poverty and exploitation that span generations. The social reformers who occasionally visit the factory arrive with notebooks and determined expressions, documenting conditions they describe as deplorable and inhumane in their published reports. Yet real change comes slowly, hampered by powerful industrial interests and a political system that views regulation as interference with free enterprise. Children like Sarah continue working while adults debate the ethics of their exploitation in comfortable drawing rooms far from the factory floor. You step into a Victorian drawing room where the wallpaper shimmers with an otherworldly beauty that seems almost too perfect to be real. The emerald green patterns dance across the walls in intricate botanical designs, delicate leaves and flowering vines that catch the gaslight and seem to pulse with their own inner life. The color is so vivid, so impossibly lush, that you feel drawn to reach out and touch it. But here's where things get interesting. That gorgeous wallpaper is slowly killing everyone in the room. The parlor feels warm and inviting, decorated in the height of Victorian fashion. Heavy velvet drapes frame tall windows. Mahogany furniture gleams with fresh polish, and that magnificent green wallpaper creates an atmosphere of refined elegance that speaks of wealth and good taste. The air carries the familiar sense of beeswax candles and coal fire. But underneath lurks something else, a faint metallic tang that you might dismiss as nothing more than the old house settling into evening. You settle into a horsehair sofa and watch the family go about their evening routine. Mrs. Whitmore adjusts a doily on the side table, her movements precise but somehow tired. Her complexion has that fashionable pale quality that Victorian ladies cultivate, though if you look closely, there's something almost grayish about her skin tone. Her husband reads his evening paper by the fireplace, occasionally coughing into a handkerchief that he quickly tucks away before anyone can see the contents. The children play quietly on the Persian rug, their energy subdued in the way that well-bred Victorian children are expected to behave. Little Emma arranges her dolls in careful rows, while her brother Thomas builds elaborate structures with wooden blocks. Both children move with a languid quality that you might attribute to good manners, but their eyes seem dull in a way that doesn't quite match their young ages. You're probably thinking this family just needs more coffee, but the truth is far more sinister. This mainstream use of arsenic-based pigments in household decorations represented one of the most widespread poisoning incidents in history. Sheely's green, invented in 1775, and Paris green, developed later, both contained copper arsenite, a compound that created the most brilliant emerald hues Victorian manufacturers had ever achieved. By the 1850s, These pigments appeared in wallpapers, fabrics, artificial flowers, children's toys, and even food coloring. The Victorian appetite for vibrant colors literally poisoned their homes. You notice how the wallpaper seems to have a subtle texture, almost like fine sand scattered across the surface. When Mrs. Whitmore dusts the walls with her feather duster, tiny particles drift into the air like green snow, catching the lamplight as they settle on furniture, floor, and family alike. The housemaid sweeps these fallen particles away each morning, unknowingly redistributing the poison throughout the house with each stroke of her broom. The family's physician, Dr. Pemberton, arrives for his weekly visit, carrying his black leather bag and wearing the expression of a man fighting a losing battle. He's been treating the Whitmores for months, prescribing tonics for their mysterious ailments: chronic fatigue, stomach pains, hair loss, and strange skin discolorations. His treatments include bloodletting, mercury compounds, and various patent medicines that probably contain more arsenic than the wallpaper itself. Sometimes Victorian medicine was less about healing and more about creative ways to poison patients. Dr. Pemberton examines young Thomas, noting the child's pale complexion and the curious green tinge around his fingernails. The boy complains of stomach cramps and has developed a persistent cough that worsens at night. His hair has begun falling out in patches, creating bare spots that his mother carefully covers with pomade and strategic combing. The doctor prescribes bed rest and a diet of milk and bread, treatments that will do nothing to address the real cause of the boy's suffering. As evening deepens, you observe the family's bedtime preparations. Each family member retires to bedrooms decorated with the same poisonous wallpaper, where they'll spend 8 hours breathing concentrated arsenic vapors. The gas lighting and coal heating actually make the situation worse, as warmth and humidity cause the wallpaper to release more toxic particles into the air. Their bedrooms become gas chambers decorated with botanical beauty. The lesser-known aspect of this crisis was how it disproportionately affected women and children who spent more time indoors surrounded by these toxic decorations. Victorian social conventions that kept ladies confined to drawing rooms and nurseries essentially sentenced them to prolonged arsenic exposure. Men, who worked outside the home, often experienced milder symptoms, leading doctors to dismiss the complaints of wives and children as hysteria or weak constitution. The wallpaper manufacturing industry knew about the dangers, but chose profits over safety with remarkable consistency. Workers in wallpaper factories regularly fell ill with symptoms identical to those experienced by customers. Yet manufacturers continued production while implementing minimal safety measures. Some factories required workers to wear cloth masks, but these provided little protection against arsenic dust. Company owners typically lived in homes decorated with expensive hand-painted wallpapers that contained no arsenic, a luxury that conveniently protected them from their own products. You watch Mrs. Whitmore arrange fresh flowers in a vase, selecting artificial blooms colored with the same deadly pigments that adorn her walls. The green leaves on these fabric flowers contain enough arsenic to poison a small dog. Yet they sit on her dining table where the family takes their meals. Victorian homes became elaborate still-life compositions of beautiful, deadly objects arranged with artistic precision. Historians still debate whether the arsenic wallpaper crisis contributed to the Victorian obsession with invalidism and chronic illness. Some argue that widespread low-level poisoning explains the period's preoccupation with mysterious ailments, nervous disorders, and general debility. Others suggest that Victorian medical ignorance simply made it impossible to connect environmental toxins with health problems, creating a perfect storm of poisoning and misdiagnosis. The social implications reach beyond individual families to reveal the period's fundamental tensions between industrial progress and human welfare. The same chemical innovations that created unprecedented prosperity also introduced new forms of suffering that Victorian science couldn't recognize or address. Arsenic wallpaper becomes a metaphor for the era itself. Beautiful surfaces concealing toxic realities. As the evening progresses, you notice how the green pigment seems to shift and change in the flickering gaslight, creating patterns that weren't visible in daylight. The wallpaper becomes almost alive, breathing with the house's rhythms, releasing its poison with each rise and fall of temperature. The beautiful botanical designs seem to mock the family's suffering, offering eternal spring in rooms where real life slowly withers away. The tragic irony of arsenic wallpaper lies in how it perfectly embodied Victorian values: beauty, status, technological progress, and domestic refinement, while literally destroying the families who embraced those ideals. The Whitmores continue their evening routine, reading, sewing, and chatting quietly, completely unaware that their beautiful home is slowly killing them with every breath they take. You descend a narrow staircase that creaks with each step, the sound muffled by thick smoke that seems to swallow every noise before it can escape. The air grows heavier as you move deeper underground, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of burning opium that clings to your clothes and settles in your throat like velvet fog. Somewhere in the darkness below, you hear the soft murmur of voices speaking in languages you don't recognize, punctuated by the gentle bubbling of water pipes and the occasional scrape of a match against rough stone. Welcome to London's hidden underworld, where Victorian moral certainty dissolves like sugar in bitter tea. The opium den you're entering exists in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, literally beneath the feet of churchgoers who file out of Sunday services, discussing the importance of Christian virtue and moral rectitude. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Though down here, most people are too blissfully unconscious to appreciate the contradiction. Your eyes adjust to the amber glow of oil lamps suspended from low-ceiling beams, revealing a scene that would make Victorian society ladies reach for their smelling salts. Bodies recline on narrow wooden bunks, stacked 3 high along the walls, their occupants lost in opium dreams that transport them far from the grimy reality of industrial London. Some wear the fine clothes of gentlemen, others the rough wool of laborers. Addiction, it seems, is remarkably democratic in its embrace. You settle onto a straw mat in the corner and watch the proprietor, an elderly Chinese man whose hands move with practiced precision as he prepares the pipes. His name is Li Wei, though most customers simply call him the professor for his encyclopedic knowledge of opium's effects and proper preparation techniques. His thin fingers work like a pianist's, heating the dark resin over a small flame until it bubbles and releases clouds of aromatic smoke that drift lazily toward the ceiling. The den operates with the efficiency of any legitimate business, complete with regular customers, established pricing, and unspoken rules of conduct. Newcomers pay premium rates for prime spots near the warmth of the central brazier, while regulars claim their favorite corners with the territorial certainty of cats claiming sunny windowsills. The social hierarchy here mirrors the world above, except that success is measured not in pounds sterling, but in the quality of one's hallucinations. This mainstream Victorian hypocrisy around opium reveals itself in layers of contradiction that would impress even the most creative moral philosopher. The same British Empire that fought 2 wars with China to force the opium trade now expresses shock and horror at domestic addiction. Government officials who profit from poppy fields in India denounce the foreign poison corrupting English youth, conveniently forgetting who controls the supply chain from cultivation to street corner sales. You observe a well-dressed gentleman in the corner, his top hat resting beside his pipe as he drifts between consciousness and dreams. During daylight hours, Mr. Ashworth serves as a magistrate, sentencing petty criminals to harsh punishments while delivering stern lectures about moral decay and personal responsibility. Here in the smoky darkness, he chases dragons made of pharmaceutical bliss, his judicial robes replaced by the universal uniform of addiction, disheveled clothes and vacant stare. The den's clientele represents a cross-section of Victorian society that would never mingle under normal circumstances. Factory workers lie beside shipping clerks, while minor aristocrats share space with professional thieves. The opium creates temporary equality, dissolving class distinctions in clouds of sweet-smelling smoke. Everyone here seeks the same escape from a world that promises progress but delivers mainly suffering, wrapped in the pretty rhetoric of moral improvement. Li Wei shares fragments of his story between customers, revealing how he arrived in London's docks 20 years ago with nothing but knowledge of the poppy's secrets. Chinese immigrants like him found themselves trapped between official persecution and unofficial demand, reviled by day, welcomed by night, exploited by the same society that claimed to despise them. His opium den provides income and survival in a city that offers few legitimate opportunities for foreign faces. The medical establishment's response to opium addiction reveals another layer of Victorian cognitive dissonance. Doctors regularly prescribe laudanum, liquid opium, for everything from teething babies to melancholy housewives, then express bafflement when patients develop dependencies. The same substance that's medicine in Harley Street becomes vice in Limehouse, as if geography somehow alters chemistry. Historians still debate whether Victorian physicians genuinely failed to understand addiction or simply chose profits over patient welfare. You watch as a young woman enters the den, her expensive dress marking her as someone who's traveled far from her usual social circle. Lady Margaret Thornfield arrives twice weekly, driven by her coachman to a respectable address 3 blocks away, then walking the remaining distance through increasingly sordid neighborhoods. Her husband, a prominent banker, believes she spends these afternoons visiting charitable organizations, which in a twisted way might be accurate if you consider drug dealers a form of social service. The economics of the opium trade create a web of complicity that extends from Chinese farmers to British politicians. Ship captains transport the raw material, customs officials look the other way for appropriate considerations, and local police raid dens just frequently enough to maintain the appearance of law enforcement. Everyone takes their cut while publicly condemning the trade, creating a system of organized hypocrisy that functions with clockwork precision. The physical environment of the den tells its own story about Victorian attitudes toward pleasure and pain. The space deliberately inverts every principle of respectable interior design. Low ceilings instead of soaring heights, darkness rather than light, horizontal rather than vertical orientation. Customers lie down instead of sitting upright, abandoning the rigid posture that Victorian society demands in favor of positions that suggest surrender and abandon. As night deepens, you hear stories drifting through the smoky air like half-remembered songs. A shipping clerk describes voyages to exotic ports where time moves differently. A seamstress recounts dreams of gardens where flowers sing lullabies in forgotten languages. These narcotic narratives create alternative realities more appealing than the gray industrial landscape waiting outside, offering temporary citizenship in countries that exist only in the chemistry of altered consciousness. The den's location in East London's labyrinth of narrow streets and dead-end alleys provides both practical concealment and symbolic significance. This underground world exists literally beneath the feet of respectable society, a shadow realm where Victorian values invert like photographic negatives. Above ground, temperance societies preach sobriety while below ground. Their own members seek liquid salvation in brown bottles and ceramic pipes. You notice how the opium affects different customers in distinctly personal ways. Some become talkative, spinning elaborate stories that blend memory with fantasy. Others sink into profound silence, their eyes tracking invisible movements across the ceiling. A few laugh at private jokes that exist only in their altered perception, while others weep for losses they can't quite remember but somehow feel with devastating clarity. You find yourself seated in an impeccably appointed morning room where every surface gleams with the kind of perfection that requires constant vigilance to maintain. The mahogany furniture reflects the soft light filtering through lace curtains with mirror-like precision, while porcelain figurines stand at perfect attention on marble-top tables like tiny sentries guarding against the chaos of everyday life. The air carries the faint scent of lemon oil and lavender, punctuated by the gentle tick of a mantel clock that measures out the hours with mathematical precision. This is the domain of Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax, a woman who has transformed domestic management into something approaching high art. She glides through her household like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, her steel blue eyes missing nothing as she ensures that every detail conforms to the exacting standards that Victorian society demands of its moral guardians. You watch her inspect a silver tea service that already sparkles like captured starlight, searching for imperfections that exist more in principle than reality. The Victorian cult of domesticity has elevated women, like Mrs. Fairfax, to the status of household deities, worshipped for their ability to create perfect domestic spheres while remaining essentially powerless outside their own front doors. Society tells them they are too pure for the corrupting influence of business or politics, too refined for the harsh realities of the working world, too morally superior to soil themselves with anything as vulgar as earning money. It's like being declared queen of a kingdom that consists entirely of drawing rooms and kitchens. You observe the morning routine that governs Mrs. Fairfax's existence with the regularity of clockwork. She rises at precisely 7, spends an hour in prayer and reflection, then begins her daily rounds of household inspection. Every servant must account for their time and tasks. Every room must pass her white glove examination. Every meal must reflect the family's social standing through its presentation and complexity. Her life unfolds according to schedules more rigid than those governing railway timetables. The household staff moves around Mrs. Fairfax with the careful choreography of dancers who know that one misstep could ruin the entire performance. The cook presents her daily menu for approval. The parlor maid displays the morning's correspondence arranged on a silver tray, and the housemaids await their specific instructions for cleaning rooms that already appear spotless. This domestic hierarchy mirrors the larger social order, with Mrs. Fairfax serving as both supreme authority and benevolent dictator in her limited realm. This mainstream ideology of separate spheres supposedly protected women from the corruption of public life, while celebrating their natural superiority in matters of morality and refinement. Victorian society argued that women's delicate constitution and elevated moral sense made them unsuitable for the rough world of commerce and politics, but perfectly equipped for the sacred duty of creating moral oases within their homes. The logical gymnastics required to maintain this position would impress modern philosophers. You notice how Mrs. Fairfax's morning reading consists entirely of periodicals devoted to domestic improvement. Magazines with titles like The Lady's Home Companion and Domestic Economy Illustrated. These publications provide detailed instructions for everything from arranging flowers to managing servants, creating an endless curriculum of household perfection that consumes her intellectual energy as completely as any professional pursuit might occupy a man's attention. The irony becomes apparent when you realize that Mrs. Fairfax possesses the organizational skills of a military general, the financial acumen of a bank manager, and the diplomatic abilities of a foreign minister. Yet these talents can only be exercised within the confines of domestic space. She oversees budgets that would challenge seasoned accountants, manages personnel with the skill of an experienced administrator, and navigates social complexities that require sophisticated understanding of human psychology and cultural nuance. Her drawing room serves as a carefully constructed stage where the family's moral and social status receives daily performance. Every piece of furniture, every decorative object, every flower arrangement communicates messages about refinement, prosperity, and virtue to visitors who understand the elaborate code of Victorian domestic display. The room itself becomes a form of literature, telling stories about the inhabitants' character and social position through material objects arranged with artistic precision. The lesser-known reality behind this cult of domesticity was how it trapped women in elegant prisons of their own supposed virtue. Mrs. Fairfax cannot own property in her own name, cannot vote, cannot pursue higher education, and cannot engage in business without her husband's permission. Yet society insists that these limitations actually represent privileges, protecting her from the degrading necessity of earning her own living or making decisions about public affairs. You watch as Mrs. Fairfax receives her weekly pin money from her husband, a small allowance that she must stretch to cover personal expenses and charitable obligations. The amount represents less than what their coachman earns, yet she's expected to manage it with gratitude and make it appear adequate for maintaining her position in society. The financial dependency that Victorian ideals celebrate as feminine delicacy often creates desperate anxiety about money that women cannot acknowledge without seeming ungrateful. The Morning Post brings invitation to a ladies' benevolent society meeting, where Mrs. Fairfax and her peers will organize charitable activities for the deserving poor. This represents the only acceptable form of public engagement for women of her class. Charity work that extends their domestic nurturing roles into limited social action. They can bandage wounds, but not question what creates them, can provide soup kitchens, but not examine the economic systems that make them necessary. Historians still debate whether the cult of domesticity genuinely reflected women's preferences or simply represented the most attractive option available within severely limited choices. Some argue that Victorian women embraced domestic ideology because it provided them with authority and influence within their restricted sphere. Others maintain that this supposed choice was really a form of coercion disguised as honor, forcing women to accept limitation as liberation. The afternoon brings music practice, another essential component of feminine accomplishment that demonstrates cultural refinement while remaining safely non-threatening to male authority. Mrs. Fairfax plays the piano with considerable skill, performing pieces that showcase technical ability without suggesting the dangerous independence that might come from genuine artistic ambition. Her music serves decorative rather than expressive purposes, background accompaniment to domestic life rather than personal statement. You observe how the cult of domesticity creates its own forms of competition and hierarchy among women, as they compete for recognition as the most accomplished hostess, the most devoted mother, or the most charitable lady in their social circle. These contests for domestic supremacy channel female ambition into approved directions while preventing solidarity that might challenge the system itself. The evening routine brings Mrs. Fairfax's family together in their perfectly appointed dining room, where conversation follows established patterns that reinforce everyone's roles. Her husband discusses business affairs that remain mysterious to her, while she reports on household management and social obligations. The children learn their proper places in this domestic theater, absorbing lessons about gender roles through daily observation of their parents' carefully scripted performances. As the day concludes, you realize that Mrs. Fairfax has worked harder than most men, managing complex operations and solving numerous problems, yet her labor remains invisible because it occurs within domestic space. The cult of domesticity has transformed women into unpaid managers of household enterprises while convincing them that this represents their highest calling and greatest privilege. You settle into a leather chair in Dr. Cranworth's consulting room, where the walls are lined with plaster skulls that stare down at you with hollow eye sockets like a parliament of the dead. Each skull bears careful markings in India ink, dividing the cranium into numbered sections that supposedly correspond to different aspects of human character. The air smells of carbolic soap and something vaguely medicinal, while afternoon sunlight streams through tall windows, casting long shadows that make the skull collection appear to nod in silent agreement with whatever diagnosis the good doctor might render. Dr. Cranworth himself cuts an impressive figure in his black frock coat, his own skull impressively large and presumably packed with the kind of superior brain matter that his science claims to measure. His fingers are long and pale, perfectly suited for the delicate art of cranial examination, and his eyes hold the confident gleam of a man who believes he can read human nature like a book written in bone. He's the kind of Victorian gentleman who could probably convince you that your hat size determines your moral character. This is the world of phrenology, where bumps on your head reveal everything from your capacity for love to your tendency toward criminal behavior. Victorian society has embraced this science with the enthusiasm typically reserved for new flavors of ice cream, transforming skull reading into a respectable profession that bridges the gap between medicine and fortune-telling. Phrenological consultations have become as fashionable as afternoon tea, offering scientific explanations for human behavior that sound impressively authoritative while requiring no actual evidence. You watch as Dr. Cranworth prepares for your examination by consulting a detailed chart that maps the human skull into 37 distinct regions. Each area supposedly controls specific mental faculties. Destructiveness lurks behind the ears, while benevolence rises majestically from the crown. According to phrenological theory, the size of each brain region determines the strength of corresponding personality traits, making character assessment a simple matter of cranial geometry. The examination begins with Dr. Cranworth's practiced hands exploring your scalp with the thoroughness of a blind person reading Braille. His fingers probe and measure, searching for the telltale bumps and indentations that will reveal your psychological profile. You feel oddly like a melon being tested for ripeness at market, except the stakes here involve your fundamental nature rather than your sweetness. This mainstream Victorian fascination with phrenology reflected the era's desperate desire to apply scientific methods to human behavior and social problems. Developed by German physician Franz Joseph Gall in the late 18th century, phrenology promised to make psychology as precise as physics, offering measurable, observable data about invisible mental processes. Victorian society embraced anything that seemed to provide scientific justification for existing social hierarchies and moral judgments. Dr. Cranworth announces his findings with the solemnity of a judge delivering a verdict. Your organ of acquisitiveness appears well developed, suggesting a healthy interest in material success. The region of combativeness shows moderate elevation, indicating courage without dangerous aggression. Most encouraging of all, your bump of veneration rises prominently, revealing proper respect for authority and religious feeling. Apparently, your skull has passed its moral inspection with flying colors. The consulting room fills with other patients awaiting their cranial destiny. A nervous young woman hopes phrenology will explain her melancholy disposition, while a proud father brings his son to confirm the boy's intellectual promise. Each person carries questions about their nature and future, seeking answers in the topography of their own heads. The scene resembles a secular confessional where absolution comes through anatomical analysis rather than spiritual guidance. You observe how phrenological examinations often confirm exactly what patients expect or hope to hear. Wealthy clients discover bumps indicating natural leadership and refined moral sense, while working-class visitors learn about their practical intelligence and honest industry. The science seems remarkably accommodating to social expectations, finding aristocratic virtues in aristocratic skulls and humble qualities in humble heads. The lesser-known applications of phrenology extended far beyond individual consultations into realms that would horrify modern ethical sensibilities. Victorian educators used cranial measurements to sort children into different academic tracks, while employers assessed job candidates' skull shapes to determine their fitness for various positions. Criminal justice systems incorporated phrenological evidence into court proceedings, with defendants' head shapes sometimes influencing sentences more than actual evidence of guilt or innocence. Dr. Cranworth maintains detailed records of his examinations, creating a vast database of cranial measurements and personality assessments that he claims will advance the science of human nature. His filing cabinets contain thousands of head profiles, each reduced to numbers and classifications that supposedly capture the essence of individual character. The systematic collection of this data gives phrenology an appearance of rigorous methodology that masks its fundamental lack of scientific validity. The practice reveals Victorian society's profound anxiety about human nature and social control. If character could be measured and predicted through skull examination, then social problems might be solved through proper breeding and education. Criminal tendencies could be identified before crimes occurred, while natural leaders could be recognized and cultivated from childhood. Phrenology promised to make human management as efficient as factory production. You notice how the consulting room's atmosphere encourages belief through carefully orchestrated staging. The impressive collection of skulls suggests vast knowledge and experience, while Dr. Cranworth's confident manner and technical vocabulary create an aura of scientific authority. The examination process itself feels medical and objective, with precise measurements and systematic procedures that mimic legitimate scientific investigation. Historians still debate whether phrenologists like Dr. Cranworth genuinely believed in their methods or simply exploited public gullibility for profit. Some practitioners demonstrated sincere conviction in phrenological principles, viewing themselves as pioneers of psychological science. Others clearly recognized the practice as lucrative pseudoscience, but continued anyway, perhaps reasoning that providing hope and confidence justified the deception. The social implications of phrenology extended into dangerous territory when combined with Victorian racial theories and class prejudices. Practitioners claimed that different ethnic groups displayed characteristic skull shapes that explained supposed intellectual and moral differences between races. These cranial comparisons provided pseudoscientific support for slavery, colonialism, and immigration restrictions, wrapping bigotry in the respectable clothing of medical terminology. As your consultation concludes, Dr. Cranworth provides a written assessment suitable for framing, complete with detailed measurements and personality predictions. The document resembles a medical prescription, authorizing you to feel confident about your natural abilities while warning against potential character weaknesses. You leave with a clearer sense of self that's based entirely on the bumps random genetics happen to place on your skull. The phrenological industry spawned numerous related businesses that capitalized on Victorian fascination with skull-based character analysis. Manufacturers produced porcelain heads marked with phrenological regions for home study, while publishers released guides for amateur practitioners. Photography studios offered to take portraits that emphasized favorable cranial features, while hat makers claimed their products could improve the appearance of problematic skull shapes. You find yourself standing in the mahogany-paneled map room of the Colonial Office, where the world has been reduced to colored pins and careful notations that transform distant suffering into abstract strategy. The air carries the scent of leather-bound volumes and pipe tobacco, while gaslight flickers across charts that divide continents with the casual precision of children drawing lines in sandbox sand. Here, in this temple of imperial ambition, you witness how Victorian Britain turns conquest into a gentleman's game played with human pieces. The massive map dominating the far wall displays the British Empire in triumphant red, spreading across the globe like spilled wine across a tablecloth. India glows scarlet, Australia blazes crimson, and red dots pepper Africa like a rash of territorial fever. Standing before this cartographic monument, you feel the intoxicating power of empire, the ability to point at distant lands and declare them yours with no more effort than it takes to move a chess piece. Lord Pemberton adjusts his spectacles as he studies reports from the northwest frontier, where British and Russian influences collide in what diplomats euphemistically call the Great Game. His manicured fingers trace supply routes and strategic positions while he discusses the placement of native regiments with the same tone he might use to arrange flowers for a dinner party. The human cost of these decisions, measured in villages burned and families destroyed, never intrudes upon these comfortable deliberations. This mainstream Victorian approach to empire combined missionary zeal with commercial pragmatism in ways that would make even modern politicians blush. Britain claimed to bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce to backward peoples who desperately needed all three, while conveniently ignoring that these peoples often possess sophisticated cultures, established religions, and thriving economies before European arrival. The white man's burden was remarkably profitable, which probably wasn't entirely coincidental. You observe the morning briefing, where colonial administrators report on their various domains with the detached efficiency of warehouse managers discussing inventory. Calcutta has exceeded its opium production targets. Cape Town requires additional troops for native pacification, and the new railway through Burma promises to open fresh markets for Manchester textiles. Each conquered territory becomes a line item in Britain's global balance sheet, valued primarily for its contribution to metropolitan prosperity. The walls display portraits of imperial heroes, generals and governors who built their reputations on successful campaigns against poorly armed indigenous populations. These men stare down with the confident expressions of people who never doubted their right to redraw maps and redistribute populations according to European convenience. Their bronze plaques list victories with dates and casualty figures that somehow never include native losses. A junior clerk enters with dispatches from various corners of the empire, each message revealing how British rule adapts local circumstances to imperial needs. Tea plantations in Ceylon operate with indentured labor that differs from slavery mainly in paperwork, while rubber extraction in Malaya proceeds through systems of forced labor that would horrify Victorian factory inspectors if applied to English workers. Distance apparently makes exploitation more palatable. The Morning Post brings letters from missionaries reporting on their progress in converting heathen souls to Christian enlightenment. These spiritual soldiers describe their work with military metaphors, conquering territory for Christ, defeating superstition through superior doctrine, and establishing beachheads of civilization in oceans of barbarism. Their reports carefully omit mention of how conversion often requires destruction of local culture, separation of families, and suppression of indigenous knowledge systems. You witness the preparation of new colonial appointments, as young men fresh from Oxford and Cambridge receive assignments to govern populations they've never met in places they can barely locate on maps. Their qualifications consist mainly of proper breeding, classical education, and unshakable confidence in British superiority. The assumption that English gentlemen can naturally govern any population anywhere reveals the breathtaking arrogance that drives imperial expansion. The lesser-known reality of Victorian imperialism was how it created global systems of extraction that persisted long after formal independence. Colonial administrations established transportation networks, legal systems, and economic structures designed to benefit metropolitan markets rather than local populations. These institutional arrangements ensured that colonies would continue serving British interests even when flying their own flags. Lord Pemberton discusses the latest intelligence from Central Asia, where Russian agents allegedly foment rebellion among Afghan tribes who show insufficient gratitude for British protection. The Great Game requires constant vigilance against foreign interference in territories that Britain considers its natural sphere of influence, despite having no more legitimate claim to them than Russia does. The hypocrisy apparently escapes notice in rooms where maps justify everything. You observe how imperial administrators develop elaborate bureaucratic languages that disguise violence as policy and exploitation as development. Pacification means military conquest, protection means political control, and development means resource extraction for export to Britain. This semantic camouflage allows officials to describe devastating interventions in terms that sound like humanitarian assistance rather than organized robbery. The afternoon brings discussions of railway construction across various colonies, projects that demonstrate how infrastructure development serves imperial rather than local needs. These railways connect resource extraction sites to ports rather than linking population centers, creating transportation networks that facilitate export while often disrupting traditional trade patterns and social relationships. The trains mainly run one direction, towards ships bound for Britain. Historians still debate whether Victorian imperialism represented genuine belief in civilizing missions or simply provided moral cover for economic exploitation. Some evidence suggests that many administrators sincerely believed they were improving backward societies through benevolent guidance. Other documents reveal cynical calculations about profit margins and strategic advantages that ignore humanitarian rhetoric entirely. The Colonial Office maintains detailed files on potential trouble spots, cataloging ethnic tensions, religious differences, and tribal rivalries that might be exploited to prevent unified resistance to British rule. The divide and rule strategy operates with scientific precision, turning local conflicts into imperial advantages while claiming to protect minorities from mutual violence. Playing different groups against each other becomes a form of statecraft. You notice how empire creates its own forms of corruption that extend far beyond simple bribery or embezzlement. The system rewards administrators who maximize extraction and minimize expenses, regardless of human costs. Success means increasing revenue and maintaining order through whatever means prove most efficient, creating incentives for brutality disguised as administrative effectiveness. Evening brings social gatherings where colonial officials and their families celebrate their service to empire while carefully avoiding discussion of the methods that make their comfortable lives possible. These drawing room conversations focus on the benefits of civilization, the gratitude of native populations, and the sacred duty of superior races to guide inferior ones toward enlightenment. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain these beliefs would challenge professional philosophers. You approach the imposing brick fortress that rises from the industrial landscape like a cathedral dedicated to human misery. The workhouse looms before you, its high walls topped with iron spikes that point skyward like accusing fingers, while barred windows stare down with the cold indifference of dead eyes. The morning air carries the acrid smell of carbolic soap mixed with something else, the distinctive odor of too many unwashed bodies crowded into spaces designed more for punishment than habitation. The heavy oak doors swing open with a groan that seems to echo from the building's very soul, revealing an entrance hall where hope comes to die. Gas jets flicker along whitewashed walls, casting dancing shadows that make the institutional green paint appear to writhe like something alive. You hear the shuffle of feet on worn flagstones, punctuated by the distant clatter of industrial machinery and the hollow echo of voices that have learned to speak in whispers. This is Victorian Britain's solution to poverty, a system designed with such exquisite cruelty that it makes modern bureaucracy look positively compassionate. The Poor Law of 1834 created these workhouses as places of less eligibility, meaning that life inside must be worse than the most miserable existence outside. The logic was beautifully simple. Make poverty so unpleasant that people will do anything to avoid it, including miraculous transformations into productive citizens. You follow the workhouse master, Mr. Grimsby, as he conducts his morning inspection with the satisfaction of a man who believes that suffering builds character. His keys jangle like tiny bells announcing the arrival of institutional authority, while his thick leather boots ring against stone floors with military precision. He surveys his domain with the pride of someone who has successfully reduced human dignity to a series of manageable procedures. The dining hall stretches before you like an aircraft hangar filled with long wooden tables where hundreds of people consume their morning gruel in enforced silence. The porridge has the consistency of wallpaper paste and probably tastes about as appetizing, but you watch desperate souls scrape every drop from their tin bowls with the focused intensity of archaeologists excavating precious artifacts. Speaking during meals results in loss of the next day's rations, creating a dining room quieter than most libraries. This mainstream Victorian approach to poverty relief reflected the era's fundamental belief that destitution resulted from moral failings rather than economic circumstances. The workhouse system assumed that poor people were essentially lazy and would only work when faced with conditions horrible enough to motivate them toward respectability. The fact that many inmates were elderly, disabled, or orphaned children didn't seem to complicate this moral calculus for the system's architects. You observe the daily routine that governs every moment of workhouse existence with clockwork precision. Inmates rise at 5:30 to the sound of a bell that could wake the dead, spend 14 hours performing mind-numbing labor, and retire to dormitories where privacy doesn't exist and comfort is forbidden by regulation. The schedule allows no time for rest, reflection, or any activity that might accidentally promote human happiness. The work assigned to inmates serves no purpose beyond keeping hands busy and spirits broken. You watch men picking oakum, unraveling old rope fiber by fiber until their fingers bleed, while women spend endless hours washing clothes in water so caustic it burns their skin. Children as young as 7 operate dangerous machinery or perform backbreaking agricultural labor that would violate modern child protection laws in spectacular fashion. Family separation represents perhaps the cruelest aspect of workhouse design, as the institution systematically destroys the one thing that might provide comfort in desperate circumstances. Husbands and wives are housed in separate wings and forbidden contact, while children are removed from parents and placed in dormitories where affection is discouraged as detrimental to proper discipline. The system treats human bonds like contraband that must be confiscated at the door. The lesser-known horror of workhouse life was how it deliberately stripped away every vestige of personal identity and autonomy. Inmates surrender their clothes for prison-like uniforms, forfeit their names for numbers, and abandon any hope of making decisions about their daily existence. The institution reduces complex human beings to anonymous units of labor, fed just enough to maintain productivity and treated just well enough to avoid public scandal. Mr. Grimsby explains the workhouse dietary with the enthusiasm of a gourmand describing fine cuisine, though the menu would challenge even the most optimistic interpretation of nutrition. Breakfast consists of bread and gruel. Dinner brings more bread with a thin soup containing mysterious meat fragments, and supper returns to the reliable combination of bread and gruel. This revolutionary 3-course meal plan apparently provides just enough calories to sustain life while ensuring that no one could possibly mistake the experience for pleasure. You visit the infirmary, where the sick receive medical attention that makes medieval practices look advanced by comparison. The workhouse doctor visits twice weekly, dispensing medications that often consist of little more than colored water while offering diagnoses based on brief visual inspections. Death rates in workhouse infirmaries exceed those in many prisons, creating a healthcare system that seems designed to accelerate rather than prevent mortality. The children's ward reveals the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian poverty management, as young inmates receive educations carefully calibrated to prepare them for lives of servitude. Boys learn basic reading and arithmetic alongside industrial skills that will fit them for factory work, while girls master domestic arts that will qualify them for positions as servants. The curriculum ensures that workhouse children will never develop aspirations beyond their assigned station in society. Historians still debate whether workhouse conditions reflected deliberate cruelty or simply the logical application of economic theories that treated human suffering as a necessary motivation for social improvement. Some evidence suggests that administrators genuinely believed harsh conditions would encourage self-reliance and moral reformation. Other documents reveal calculating efforts to minimize expenses while maximizing deterrent effects, treating poverty relief as a business optimization problem. You observe how the workhouse system creates its own forms of resistance and solidarity among inmates who find ways to maintain human dignity despite institutional efforts to destroy it. Secret communications pass between separated family members, while small acts of kindness, sharing food, comforting the sick, protecting the vulnerable, demonstrate that humanity survives even in places designed to crush it. The visiting committee arrives for their monthly inspection, consisting of local worthies who spend a comfortable hour touring selected areas while receiving carefully prepared reports on institutional efficiency. These gentlemen nod approvingly at cost savings and orderly procedures while remaining carefully ignorant of the human misery that makes such efficiency possible. They leave satisfied that their community's poor are receiving appropriate care. Evening brings the most devastating moment of workhouse existence, as families separated by institutional rules glimpse each other across exercise yards, but cannot embrace, speak, or offer comfort. Parents watch their children from forbidden distances, while spouses communicate through gestures that speak volumes about love persisting despite systematic efforts to destroy it. You find yourself seated around a circular mahogany table in a dimly lit parlor where the boundary between life and death apparently becomes as porous as Victorian morality. Heavy velvet curtains block out the afternoon sun, while gas jets flicker with deliberately theatrical timing that would make Broadway directors envious. The air carries the scent of jasmine incense, mixed with something metallic, perhaps ectoplasm, or more likely, the residue from whatever chemical tricks Madame Petrova uses to convince grieving souls that their departed loved ones are just a seance away. The medium herself sits across from you, draped in black silk that rustles with each calculated movement. Her dark eyes hold the kind of mysterious intensity that comes from years of practice reading people's desperate hopes and exploiting them with artistic precision. Madame Petrova claims direct communication with the spirit world, though you suspect her supernatural abilities are less impressive than her natural talent for separating Victorian families from their money. This is the height of the Victorian spiritualism craze, where scientific rationality collides with desperate grief to create a booming industry in supernatural customer service. The same society that prides itself on empirical thinking and industrial progress also spends fortunes trying to contact dead relatives through table rapping, automatic writing, and ectoplasmic manifestations that would make medieval witch trials look scientifically rigorous. The seance participants represent a cross-section of Victorian society united by loss and willing to suspend disbelief for the possibility of one more conversation with those they've loved and lost. Mrs. Worthington clutches a lace handkerchief while hoping to contact her son who died in India, while Mr. Blackwood seeks business advice from his deceased father's spirit. Apparently, even death doesn't excuse Victorian gentlemen from their commercial obligations. You watch as Madame Petrova begins her performance, though she would insist it's a sacred ritual, by calling upon her spirit guide, a Native American chief named Running Bear, who seems remarkably well-versed in Victorian social conventions for someone who presumably died before European contact. Her voice drops to an otherworldly whisper as she claims to feel supernatural presences gathering around the table, like invisible dinner guests arriving fashionably late. This mainstream Victorian fascination with spiritualism emerged from the collision of scientific materialism with traditional religious belief, creating a spiritual marketplace where faith competed with empirical evidence. The movement promised to make religion scientific by providing measurable proof of life after death, while simultaneously making science spiritual by acknowledging forces beyond material explanation. It was like trying to have your theological cake and eat it too. The table begins to shudder and rock with mysterious forces that have nothing to do with the hidden mechanisms Madame Petrova operates with her feet beneath the ornate tablecloth. Participants gasp as rapping sounds echo through the room. 1 rap for yes, 2 for no, 3 for please send more money to maintain this connection with the beyond. The deceased apparently communicate through a binary code system that would challenge modern programmers. You observe how spiritualism provides comfort for people struggling with Victorian death rates that make medieval plagues look like mild inconveniences. When families regularly lose children to disease and industrial accidents claim breadwinners with monotonous frequency, the promise of continued communication with the departed offers psychological relief that conventional religion sometimes fails to provide. Who wouldn't want to believe that death is just a forwarding address rather than a final destination? The seance reaches its climax as Madame Petrova begins producing ectoplasm, a mysterious substance that looks suspiciously like cheesecloth soaked in luminous paint. The ghostly material emerges from various bodily orifices in ways that would be comical if the participants weren't so desperately sincere in their need to believe. Modern stage magicians would be impressed by the technical complexity, if not the ethical implications. The lesser-known aspect of Victorian spiritualism was how it provided women with unprecedented opportunities for public speaking and religious authority in a society that normally confined them to domestic roles. Female mediums could claim divine inspiration for behaviors that would otherwise be considered scandalous. Speaking in public, controlling seances, even starting their own religious movements. The spirits apparently had more progressive views on gender equality than most Victorian men. Mrs. Worthington begins weeping as Madame Petrova channels her deceased son's spirit, delivering messages that demonstrate remarkable knowledge of family details that could easily be gathered through careful observation and strategic questioning. The grieving mother hears exactly what she needs to hear, that her boy is happy, safe, and waiting for their eventual reunion. The comfort is genuine even if the supernatural claims are somewhat questionable. You notice how spiritualist gatherings create their own social dynamics that mirror Victorian class distinctions, even in the realm of the supernatural. Wealthy clients receive private consultations with elaborate manifestations, while working-class believers attend group seances with more modest, ghostly entertainment. Apparently, even in death, social status determines the quality of one's spiritual customer service experience. The business aspects of spiritualism reveal Victorian entrepreneurship at its most creative, as mediums develop elaborate pricing structures for different types of supernatural services. Basic spirit communication costs less than materialization phenomena, while prophecy and healing command premium rates. Some enterprising mediums offer package deals and payment plans, making the afterlife accessible to budget-conscious believers. Historians still debate whether spiritualist mediums genuinely believed in their abilities or simply exploited public grief for financial gain. Some evidence suggests that many practitioners convinced themselves of their own supernatural powers through repeated performances and positive audience feedback. Others clearly operated as conscious fraudsters who viewed spiritualism as a lucrative form of theater with particularly credulous audiences. The scientific community's response to spiritualism reveals the era's struggle between empirical skepticism and open-minded investigation. Serious researchers like Alfred Russel Wallace and William Crookes subjected mediums to controlled experiments, while other scientists dismissed the entire movement as elaborate fraud. The debate continues today, though with significantly less ectoplasm and considerably more statistical analysis. As the seance concludes, participants leave with renewed hope and lighter purses, carrying messages from beyond that sound remarkably similar to what living relatives might say if they possessed perfect knowledge of what the grieving needed to hear. Madame Petrova counts her evening's receipts while planning improvements to her ectoplasm production techniques and considering whether to add levitation to her repertoire of supernatural services. The spiritualism craze reflects Victorian society's fundamental contradiction between scientific progress and spiritual need, creating a marketplace where both authentic seekers and talented fraudsters could find their audiences. In an age when traditional religions struggled to address modern anxieties while science offered knowledge without comfort, spiritualism promised the best of both worlds. Empirical proof of spiritual realities that transcended material existence. You crouch behind a weathered headstone in Kensal Green Cemetery, where the fog rolls between ancient oaks like ghostly fingers searching for something lost. The autumn night carries the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves, punctuated by the distant clang of iron spades against coffin wood. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, you hear the muffled voices of men who make their living from other people's deaths, not as undertakers or mourners, but as professional thieves who steal bodies with the same businesslike efficiency that others steal silver. Your pocket watch shows midnight, the witching hour when resurrection men emerge from whatever shadows hide them during daylight hours. These aren't supernatural creatures, despite their ghoulish profession. They're ordinary working men who've discovered that fresh corpses command premium prices in a medical marketplace that desperately needs bodies, but refuses to acknowledge how they're obtained. The sound of approaching footsteps makes you press closer against the cold marble monument, feeling the carved inscription beneath your fingertips. Here lies Margaret Ashford, beloved wife and mother, taken too soon. Margaret, unfortunately, won't be resting in peace much longer if the men approaching with their dark lanterns and canvas sacks have anything to say about the matter. This is Victorian medical progress at its most hypocritical, a system where respectable physicians demand fresh anatomical specimens while maintaining plausible deniability about how those specimens arrive on their dissection tables. The same doctors who would never dream of grave robbing personally somehow develop convenient blindness when suspiciously fresh corpses appear in their lecture halls, complete with graveyard soil still clinging to the burial shrouds. You watch as three figures emerge from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, though their motivations are disappointingly practical rather than supernatural. The leader, a thin man called Digger Morrison, carries himself with the professional confidence of someone who's perfected his craft through years of nocturnal practice. His companions follow behind, carrying the tools of their peculiar trade: spades, ropes, and wooden planks for leverage. The resurrection men work with practiced efficiency that would impress any factory supervisor, having refined body snatching into something approaching an industrial process. They begin by locating the head of the grave, then dig a narrow shaft down to the coffin rather than excavating the entire burial site. This technique reduces both time and evidence, allowing them to extract their prize while leaving minimal traces of disturbance. This mainstream practice of body snatching flourished because Victorian law created a perfect storm of legal contradictions that made anatomical study nearly impossible through legitimate means. Murder was illegal, but stealing corpses was only a misdemeanor since dead bodies technically belonged to no one. Medical schools needed cadavers for teaching, but public sentiment demanded that the dead remain undisturbed. The solution was a thriving black market that everyone used and no one acknowledged. You listen to the systematic sounds of professional grave robbing, the careful scraping of earth, the muffled thuds of spades striking wood, and the creaking of coffin hinges that were never designed to open twice. Digger Morrison works with the focused concentration of a craftsman, muttering instructions to his assistants in language that transforms theft into technical procedure. The medical establishment's relationship with resurrection men reveals Victorian hypocrisy at its most refined. Anatomy professors pay premium prices for fresh subjects, while carefully avoiding questions about provenance or procurement methods. The transaction typically occurs through intermediaries who maintain the fiction that doctors remain ignorant of the corpse's criminal origins. It's like buying stolen goods while claiming you thought they fell off a truck. The body emerges from its premature grave with the soggy efficiency of a factory product rolling off an assembly line. Morrison examines his merchandise with professional detachment, checking for signs of disease or decomposition that might affect market value. Fresh corpses command top prices, while older specimens sell at discount rates that reflect their diminished educational utility. You observe how the resurrection trade has developed its own sophisticated network of suppliers, transporters, and customers that rivals any legitimate business enterprise. Grave watchers patrol cemeteries during vulnerable periods immediately after burial, while professional lookouts monitor police movements and cemetery security. The entire operation requires coordination, timing, and business acumen that would serve any Victorian entrepreneur well. The lesser-known reality of body snatching was how it disproportionately affected the poor, whose graves lacked the iron cages and elaborate security measures that protected wealthy burial sites. Pauper cemeteries provided easy pickings for resurrection men, while expensive private graveyards remained largely undisturbed. Even in death, class distinctions determined whether you'd rest in peace or contribute involuntarily to medical education. Morrison's team loads their prize into a specially modified cart designed to look like any other nighttime delivery vehicle. The corpse travels beneath vegetables or coal, disguised as legitimate cargo, should constables ask inconvenient questions about late-night transportation. The resurrection men have thought of everything, creating a distribution network that would make modern logistics companies envious. The economic aspects of body snatching reveal how Victorian capitalism adapted to serve even the most macabre markets. Fresh corpses sold for prices equivalent to several months' wages for working men, creating powerful incentives for people willing to overcome moral squeamishness about grave robbing. Some resurrection men operated successful businesses with multiple employees, regular customers, and professional reputations within their specialized field. You follow the cart through fog-shrouded streets toward the medical district, where anatomical schools await their illicit deliveries with the eager anticipation of children expecting Christmas presents. The professors know exactly when to expect their shipments, having placed orders like any other commercial transaction. The only difference is that these customers pay cash and ask no questions about inventory sources. Historians still debate whether body snatching actually advanced medical knowledge or simply satisfied morbid curiosity disguised as scientific inquiry. Some argue that anatomical study revolutionized medical understanding and saved countless lives through improved surgical techniques. Others maintain that the resurrection trade primarily served the financial interests of medical schools while treating human remains as commercial commodities. The arrival at St. Bartholomew's Medical College reveals the seamless transition from criminal activity to respectable education. The corpse disappears through basement doors into lecture halls where tomorrow's physicians will practice their craft on stolen flesh, while receiving instruction in medical ethics and professional responsibility. The irony apparently escapes notice in rooms where moral instruction proceeds over illegally obtained anatomical specimens. As dawn approaches, you realize that Morrison and his crew will return to their daylight occupations, perhaps as laborers, shopkeepers, or even church sextons, carrying on ordinary lives that provide perfect cover for their nocturnal profession. The resurrection trade operates in society's shadows, invisible but essential to institutions that depend on its services while publicly condemning its methods. You find yourself standing in a narrow drawing room where the afternoon light filters through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across walls lined with mahogany bookshelves that seem to hold the accumulated wisdom of generations. The air carries the faint scent of lavender water and furniture polish, mixed with something indefinable, perhaps the lingering presence of secrets that have learned to hide in plain sight. This is the domain of Mrs. Adelaide Thornfield, a woman whose gentle demeanor conceals a mind sharp enough to navigate the treacherous waters of domestic management while maintaining the fiction that she knows nothing about the world beyond her front door. You settle into a horsehair chair and watch as Mrs. Thornfield arranges fresh flowers in a crystal vase. Her movements precise and practiced despite the tremor in her hands that she attributes to nerves, but which you recognize as something else entirely. The roses she's chosen are perfect specimens, their petals unblemished, their stems cut at precisely the right angle. Yet as you observe more closely, you notice how she handles them with the careful attention of someone who understands the delicate balance between beauty and concealment. The tea service arrives on a silver tray that reflects the gaslight like captured starlight, carried by a parlor maid whose movements suggest years of training in the art of invisible efficiency. You watch Mrs. Thornfield pour with the graceful precision that Victorian ladies perfect through decades of practice, creating the kind of domestic tableau that speaks of refinement, prosperity, and moral certainty. But something in her eyes suggests that this performance, however beautifully executed, conceals complexities that polite society would prefer not to acknowledge. This is the hidden world of Victorian domestic service, where armies of invisible workers maintain the illusion of effortless gentility that defines middle-class respectability. Below stairs, in kitchens and sculleries that never appear in family photographs, another society operates according to its own rules and hierarchies. The servants who make possible the leisured elegance you observe upstairs inhabit a parallel universe that touches the visible world only at carefully controlled points of intersection. You descend through a green baize door that separates the family's domain from the working areas of the house, feeling the temperature drop as you enter spaces designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The servants' hall stretches before you like the common room of some austere institution, furnished with plain wooden tables and hard chairs that remind everyone of their place in the household hierarchy. The air here carries different scents: carbolic soap, black lead polish, and the perpetual dampness that comes from constant washing and scrubbing. The kitchen bustles with activity as Mrs. Hartwell, the cook, orchestrates the evening meal with the precision of a military commander deploying troops. Her domain extends from the massive coal-fired range to the pantries and storerooms that line the basement corridors, creating a subterranean empire where she reigns with absolute authority over everything edible. You watch her taste sauces with the focused concentration of a chemist testing compounds, adjusting seasonings with the kind of expertise that comes from feeding people whose standards are unforgiving but whose appreciation is rarely expressed. This mainstream system of domestic service provided employment for millions of working-class women and men while creating elaborate hierarchies that rivaled those in government or military organizations. The largest households employed dozens of servants ranging from the butler and housekeeper at the top to scullery maids and boot boys at the bottom, each position carrying specific duties, privileges, and prospects for advancement. The servants' hall operated as a complete society with its own social distinctions, romantic entanglements, and political intrigue. You observe the evening meal being prepared for the family upstairs, a 7-course dinner that will occupy their attention for 2 hours while requiring the coordinated efforts of half a dozen servants working in carefully choreographed sequence. The irony isn't lost on you that people who never cook, clean, or perform physical labor will spend their evening discussing the importance of hard work and moral virtue while being waited upon by individuals whose labor makes such discussions possible. The housemaids begin their final cleaning duties of the day, moving through the house like ghosts restoring order after the family's daily disruption. They replace soiled linens with fresh ones, remove every trace of dust from surfaces that will be dusty again by morning, and ensure that the family will wake to a house that appears to maintain itself through some form of domestic magic. Their work must be completed invisibly. Evidence of cleaning is almost as objectionable as evidence of dirt. You notice how the servants develop their own forms of communication and solidarity that exist beneath the surface of official household management. Meaningful glances pass between maids who share information about family secrets, while the butler and housekeeper conduct their own private diplomatic relations that determine how household policies are actually implemented. These underground networks of knowledge and mutual support create parallel societies that the employing families neither understand nor acknowledge. The lesser-known reality of Victorian domestic service was how it created intimate knowledge while requiring absolute discretion, turning servants into repositories of family secrets who could never acknowledge what they knew. Housemaids knew which marriages were unhappy, which children were illegitimate, and which gentlemen had gambling debts or drinking problems. This knowledge represented a form of power that could never be exercised without destroying the very livelihood that made it possible. Evening brings the servants' own dinner in their hall, where conversation flows according to strict protocols that reflect the hierarchy existing upstairs but adapted to downstairs circumstances. The butler sits at the head of the table like a paternal figure presiding over his extended family, while newer servants listen respectfully to veterans who share wisdom about navigating the complex social dynamics that govern domestic life. You probably think your workplace politics are complicated, but try managing the emotional dynamics of people who live together under constant supervision. You watch as individual servants retreat to their tiny bedrooms in the attics, spaces barely large enough for a single bed and washstand, but which represent the only privacy available in lives spent serving other people's needs. These rooms contain the modest possessions that constitute each person's claim to individual identity. Letters from home, small religious tokens, perhaps a book or photograph that connects them to life beyond the house. The economic relationship between employers and servants reveals another layer of Victorian contradictions, as families who preach the virtues of thrift and economy spend enormous sums maintaining domestic establishments that serve primarily as displays of social status. The cost of keeping servants often exceeded the family's spending on food, clothing, or entertainment. Yet these expenses were considered essential investments in respectability rather than luxurious indulgences. The evening continues with small acts of rebellion that would scandalize the family upstairs if they ever discovered them. Mary, the parlor maid, secretly reads novels borrowed from the library she's forbidden to touch, while James, The footman practices elocution lessons that might someday help him transcend his current station. These quiet aspirations represent forms of resistance that operate within the system while gradually subverting it. Historians still debate whether domestic service provided genuine opportunities for working-class advancement or simply created elaborate systems of exploitation disguised as family relationships. Some servants developed valuable skills and eventually established their own businesses, while others spent their lives in service without accumulating savings or acquiring marketable abilities. The paternalistic rhetoric that described servants as family members often masked employment relationships that offered little security and limited autonomy. As the house settles into nighttime quiet, you realize that the servants' work continues even in sleep, as they remain on call for any emergency or whim that might require their attention. Their rest is conditional, their privacy limited, and their personal lives subordinated to the needs of people whose comfort depends entirely on their invisible labor. The domestic paradise that Victorian families inhabit rests on foundations of service that remain carefully hidden from view, like a beautiful garden growing over carefully buried secrets. You find yourself standing in a narrow cobblestone street where the morning fog clings to grimy brick buildings like unwelcome guests who've overstayed their welcome. The air carries a thick, soupy quality that makes your lungs work harder with each breath, while church bells toll in the distance with their familiar rhythm that once marked time for worship, but now serves as a death knell for thousands of Londoners who don't yet realize their fate. This is Broad Street in Soho, where the autumn of 1854 is about to teach Victorian medicine a lesson in humility that it absolutely refuses to learn. You watch as Dr. John Snow adjusts his spectacles and stares thoughtfully at a hand-drawn map spread across his kitchen table. Its surface covered with small black marks that represent something far more sinister than mere statistical data. Each mark indicates a death from cholera, and the pattern emerging suggests that the disease isn't spreading through mysterious miasmas floating on London's perpetually foul air, but through something much more mundane and infinitely more terrifying: the water that flows from the Broad Street pump. The morning brings fresh horrors as you observe families carrying their dead to overcrowded churchyards, their faces masks of resignation that speak of a society grown accustomed to inexplicable mortality. Children who played in the streets yesterday now lie wrapped in linen shrouds, while their parents struggle to understand why death moves through their neighborhood with the methodical efficiency of a factory worker completing routine tasks. This mainstream Victorian approach to epidemic disease reveals the era's fundamental inability to distinguish between correlation and superstition, creating medical responses that often killed more people than they saved. The prevailing miasma theory insisted that cholera spread through poisonous vapors arising from decay and filth, leading to treatments that involved burning aromatic herbs, improving ventilation, and avoiding night air, none of which addressed the actual cause of infection. Sometimes Victorian science was less about evidence and more about elaborate ways to be confidently wrong. Dr. Snow's unconventional investigation begins with the kind of methodical observation that his colleagues dismiss as unnecessarily detailed record-keeping. You follow him as he visits every household touched by cholera, mapping the disease's progress with the precision of a military strategist plotting enemy movements. His interviews reveal patterns that the medical establishment finds inconvenient. Deaths cluster around specific water sources while areas served by different suppliers remain mysteriously unaffected. The Board of Health meets in their comfortable offices, where distinguished gentlemen in frock coats debate the epidemic with the confident ignorance that characterizes Victorian expertise. They speak eloquently about atmospheric disturbances and moral deficiency while completely ignoring Dr. Snow's water-based theories, preferring explanations that confirm existing prejudices about the poor, the foreign, and the morally suspect. Their response to cholera involves removing nuisances, improving drainage, and lectures about personal hygiene that assume disease results from character flaws rather than contaminated water supplies. You observe the Broad Street pump in action as neighborhood residents fill their buckets in jugs from the very source that's killing them with mechanical regularity. The water appears clear and tastes fresh, giving no hint of the microscopic death that swims in every drop. Families who pride themselves on using the best water in the district unknowingly consume concentrated doses of their neighbors' intestinal discharges, creating a cycle of infection that accelerates with each passing day. The lesser-known aspect of Victorian cholera outbreaks was how they revealed the complete inadequacy of urban infrastructure that prioritized industrial production over human health. London's water system mixed drinking supplies with sewage disposal in ways that would horrify modern engineers, while overcrowded housing created perfect conditions for disease transmission. The same policies that generated enormous profits for property developers and industrialists also created public health disasters that killed thousands. Dr. Snow's famous removal of the Broad Street pump handle becomes both a practical intervention and a symbolic challenge to medical orthodoxy that refuses to acknowledge evidence contradicting established theories. You watch him convince local authorities to disable the pump through persistence and careful argumentation. Though most officials remain convinced that cholera spreads through airborne poison rather than waterborne bacteria. His success comes despite medical opinion rather than because of it. The epidemic's social dynamics reveal how Victorian class prejudices shaped both disease transmission and medical response. Wealthy neighborhoods with private water supplies experienced lower infection rates, while poor areas dependent on public pumps suffered devastating losses. Yet medical authorities explain these differences through moral rather than environmental factors, arguing that cholera attacked the intemperate, the improvident, and the spiritually weak rather than those unfortunate enough to drink contaminated water. You witness the heartbreaking scenes that unfold in overcrowded tenements, where entire families succumb to cholera within days of the first symptoms appearing. The disease kills with brutal efficiency. Violent diarrhea and vomiting lead to dehydration and death within hours, leaving survivors traumatized and confused about what invisible force has devastated their community. The speed and severity of cholera mortality creates an atmosphere of supernatural dread that makes rational investigation almost impossible. The medical establishment's treatment protocols reveal Victorian medicine at its most dangerously confident, as physicians prescribe remedies that often accelerate rather than prevent death. Bleeding, purging, and administering mercury compounds become standard responses to a disease caused by dehydration, creating therapeutic interventions that compound the very problems they claim to address. Honestly, you've probably received better medical advice from fortune cookies than cholera patients got from Victorian doctors. Evening brings the cholera carts that rumble through infected neighborhoods, collecting bodies with the mechanical efficiency of garbage collection. The drivers work in shifts around the clock, their grim cargo destined for mass graves that can barely accommodate the daily harvest of death. These scenes repeat across London with clockwork regularity, creating a parallel economy of mortality that operates alongside normal commercial life. Historians still debate whether Dr. Snow's pump handle removal actually ended the outbreak or simply coincided with the epidemic's natural decline. Some evidence suggests that cholera was already subsiding when the pump was disabled, while other data indicates that removing the contaminated water source prevented additional infections. The controversy illustrates how difficult it can be to establish causation, even when correlation seems obvious. As the outbreak gradually subsides, you realize that Dr. Snow's victory represents not triumph of evidence over ignorance, but the temporary success of one persistent individual against institutional resistance that will continue long after this particular epidemic ends. The waterborne theory of cholera transmission will eventually revolutionize public health, but only after decades of additional suffering that could have been prevented if Victorian medicine possessed the humility to acknowledge its own limitations. You find yourself standing on the platform of Manchester's Victoria Station, where the thunderous roar of steam engines mingles with the excited chatter of investors who believe they've discovered the secret to eternal prosperity. The air shimmers with coal smoke and human ambition, while the platform vibrates beneath your feet from the constant arrival and departure of trains that promise to transform Britain into a network of golden opportunity. This is the height of railway mania, where rational men lose their minds over iron tracks and wooden sleepers with the same passion that medieval knights reserved for holy crusades. The morning brings fresh speculators clutching railway prospectuses like sacred texts, their eyes bright with the fever that comes from believing you've spotted the next great fortune before everyone else catches on. These gentlemen in silk top hats and fine wool coats represent every level of society, from aristocratic landowners to humble clerks who've mortgaged their futures on the promise that railway shares will rise as inevitably as the morning sun. You watch them studying timetables and route maps with the intensity of generals planning military campaigns, apparently convinced that geographical lines on paper automatically translate into streams of dividend payments. This mainstream Victorian obsession with railway investment created speculative bubbles that would make modern financial advisors reach for their emergency medication. Between 1840 and 1847, Parliament authorized the construction of over 8,000 miles of new railway track, requiring capital investments that exceeded the entire national debt. Everyone from wealthy merchants to domestic servants invested their savings in railway companies that existed mainly on paper, creating a collective delusion that progress and profit moved forward with locomotive inevitability. You observe Mr. Pemberton, a prosperous grain merchant, as he explains his investment strategy to a circle of eager listeners who hang on his every word like disciples receiving financial scripture. His portfolio includes shares in the Grand Junction Railway, the London and Birmingham line, and something called the Direct London and Exeter Railway that promises to revolutionize travel between the capital and the West Country. He speaks with the confidence of someone who's never experienced a market crash, apparently believing the demand for railway transport will grow exponentially until every person in Britain travels by train at least twice daily. The railway fever spreads through society with the infectious enthusiasm of people who've confused technological innovation with guaranteed profit margins. Farmers mortgage their land to buy railway shares, while small shopkeepers liquidate their inventory to invest in companies promising to build lines through territories that may or may not exist. The speculation reaches such heights that proposals emerge for underwater railways, pneumatic tube transport, and lines connecting Britain to Ireland through tunnels that would challenge the engineering skills of ancient gods. You board the 10:15 to Birmingham, where first-class passengers discuss their railway portfolios with the same reverence that previous generations reserved for religious discussions. The compartment fills with tobacco, smoke, and optimistic calculations as gentlemen compare their expected returns from different railway ventures. Their conversations reveal a touching faith in Victorian engineering combined with complete ignorance of basic economic principles, apparently believing that building more railways automatically creates more passengers who need to travel between places they've never considered visiting. The lesser-known reality behind railway mania was how it created sophisticated networks of fraud and market manipulation that would impress modern financial criminals. Unscrupulous promoters established companies with impressive names and fictional assets, selling shares to investors who never bothered to verify whether proposed railway lines actually connected real destinations. Some railways existed only as elaborate maps and detailed prospectuses, while others began construction but ran out of money after building expensive bridges that led nowhere. During the journey, you meet Lady Marchmont, an elderly widow who's invested her late husband's inheritance in a portfolio of railway shares that she describes with the pride of a gardener discussing prize-winning roses. Her investments include the York and North Midland Railway, which promises excellent returns despite operating through terrain that seems geographically challenging, and shares in Stephenson's locomotive works that manufacture engines faster than railway companies can afford to purchase them. She apparently believes that railway prosperity operates independently of mundane concerns like passenger demand or freight volume. The train passes construction sites where armies of laborers, known as navvies, blast through hillsides and build embankments with the focused intensity of people who understand that their work creates the physical foundation for other people's financial fantasies. These men earn good wages during the construction boom, but their employment depends entirely on continued investor enthusiasm for projects that may never generate sufficient revenue to justify their construction costs. You observe how railway speculation creates its own social dynamics, as established families risk ancestral fortunes on transportation schemes that exist mainly in engineers' imaginations. Country squires who've managed their estates conservatively for generations suddenly embrace investment strategies that would make Las Vegas gamblers nervous, apparently believing that railway shares represent safer investments than agricultural land that's produced reliable income for centuries. The afternoon brings news of fresh railway proposals that promise even more spectacular returns than existing ventures. A new company plans to build a line directly through the center of London, requiring the demolition of numerous historic buildings, but offering shareholders the prospect of enormous profits from urban passenger traffic. Another scheme proposes connecting Manchester to Liverpool through a route that would revolutionize industrial transportation while generating dividends sufficient to fund early retirement for prudent investors. The gentle rocking motion of the carriage lulls some passengers into contemplative silence, while others continue their animated discussions about projected returns and engineering marvels. You feel the rhythmic clacking of wheels against rails, a sound that's become the heartbeat of Victorian progress, steady and reassuring until the day when the music stops and investors realize they've been dancing to a tune that only exists in their optimistic imaginations. Historians still debate whether railway mania represented rational response to genuine technological revolution or simply mass hysteria disguised as investment strategy. Some argue that railway construction genuinely transformed British commerce and justified investor enthusiasm despite short-term market volatility. Others maintain that the speculation created financial bubbles that enriched promoters while devastating ordinary investors who confused innovation with automatic profitability. As evening approaches and the train continues its journey through the darkening countryside, you realize that railway mania reveals Victorian society's fundamental tension between conservative values and speculative enthusiasm. The same people who preach prudence and moral responsibility in their daily lives embrace investment strategies that depend entirely on other people's continued willingness to pay increasingly irrational prices for shares in companies that may never operate profitable railways. The iron tracks stretching across the British landscape represent both genuine progress and elaborate monuments to human gullibility, carrying passengers toward destinations that may prove as fictional as the returns their investments promise to deliver. You find yourself standing outside Newgate Prison on a crisp October morning, where the crowd gathers with the festive atmosphere of people attending a particularly macabre carnival. The air carries the scent of roasted chestnuts and gin-soaked breath, while excited voices rise and fall like waves at high tide. This isn't a market day or religious festival. It's execution morning, and Victorian London has turned judicial murder into the most popular entertainment of the age. The gallows looms before you like a grotesque stage set, its wooden beams freshly painted black for this morning's performance. Carpenters have worked through the night to ensure that the trapdoor mechanism operates smoothly, because nothing ruins a good hanging like technical difficulties. The crowd presses forward with eager anticipation, parents lifting children onto their shoulders for better views of what they consider essential moral education. You observe families who've traveled from neighboring counties specifically to witness this spectacle, carrying picnic baskets and treating the occasion like a day at the seaside. Vendors move through the crowd selling broadsides containing the condemned man's confession. Whether authentic or fictional hardly matters, since the public demands narrative satisfaction along with their judicial entertainment. The atmosphere resembles a county fair, complete with pickpockets, street musicians, and hawkers selling everything from hot pies to commemorative ribbons. This mainstream Victorian approach to criminal justice transformed punishment into public theater where moral instruction merged with popular entertainment in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. The authorities insisted that public executions served as powerful deterrents to crime while providing salutary lessons about divine justice and social order. The fact that these events actually increased local crime rates, as pickpockets worked the crowds and copycat offenses spiked, apparently didn't complicate this moral arithmetic. The condemned man appears at the prison door, flanked by guards and a chaplain who reads from a prayer book with the mechanical precision of someone who's performed this ritual countless times before. Thomas Hartwell, convicted of burglary, looks smaller than you'd expected. A thin, nervous man whose crime involved stealing silverware worth less than what wealthy spectators spend on their morning entertainment. His execution will cost the state more than his theft cost his victims. But Victorian justice operates according to principles that treat symbolism as more important than economics. The crowd erupts in cheers and catcalls as Hartwell mounts the scaffold, some spectators placing bets on whether he'll maintain his composure or break down in tears. The execution protocol unfolds with ceremonial precision. The reading of the death warrant, the opportunity for final words, and the placement of the hood and noose while the crowd provides running commentary like spectators at a boxing match. You notice how the spectacle creates its own social dynamics that mirror Victorian class distinctions even in death. Wealthy observers rent windows in nearby buildings for premium viewing, while the working classes pack the streets below like sardines in a tin. Private boxes offer refreshments and comfortable seating, transforming execution attendance into a luxury experience that allows the prosperous to enjoy their moral superiority while maintaining physical distance from the unwashed masses. The lesser-known aspect of Victorian public executions was how they created lucrative industries that depended entirely on judicial killing for their survival. Enterprising businessmen established viewing stands that charged admission fees, while taverns near execution sites experienced booming trade on hanging days. Professional mourners offered their services to condemned prisoners' families, and souvenir merchants sold everything from pieces of rope to locks of the deceased's hair. The chaplain delivers a brief sermon about divine justice and earthly retribution, his words carrying across the crowd with the practiced cadence of someone who's found a reliable formula for moral instruction. He speaks about the wages of sin and the importance of lawful behavior, while addressing an audience that includes numerous criminals, prostitutes, and confidence men who view execution day as excellent business opportunity rather than moral education. Hartwell's final moments reveal the intersection of individual tragedy and institutional hypocrisy that defines Victorian criminal justice. He speaks briefly about his regret and hope for divine forgiveness, words that seem genuine despite their conventional phrasing. The crowd listens with the focused attention they might give a theatrical performance, treating his final statement as entertainment rather than the last utterance of a human being about to die for stealing household goods. The execution itself occurs with mechanical efficiency that transforms human death into bureaucratic procedure. The trapdoor opens with a loud bang that startles pigeons from nearby rooftops, while the crowd releases a collective gasp that contains equal parts satisfaction and horror. Victorian justice has been served with public witness, though whether this serves any purpose beyond satisfying societal bloodlust remains an open question. You feel the weight of collective complicity as thousands of people celebrate institutional violence while claiming moral authority over those they've condemned. The spectacle reveals how easily civilized society transforms individual tragedy into public entertainment, creating rituals that serve power rather than justice while maintaining the comfortable fiction that punishment serves deterrent rather than retributive purposes. Historians still debate whether public executions actually deterred crime or simply provided socially acceptable outlets for violent impulses that civilization claimed to suppress. Some evidence suggests that execution days coincided with spikes in local crime rates, as criminals took advantage of distracted police and crowds of intoxicated spectators. Other data indicates that the spectacle reinforced social hierarchy by demonstrating state power over individual lives. The crowd begins to disperse with the satisfied air of people who've witnessed something significant, though exactly what remains unclear. Some spectators discuss the execution's moral lessons, while others critique the condemned man's performance like theater critics reviewing a disappointing production. Street cleaners begin clearing the debris left by thousands of people who've gathered to watch one person die in the name of justice and moral instruction. As the mourning crowd melts away into London's maze of streets and alleys, you realize that Victorian public executions reveal the era's a fundamental contradiction between civilized pretensions and barbaric entertainment. The same society that preaches moral refinement and Christian charity also gathers in thousands to watch human beings die for crimes that often amount to desperate attempts at survival in an economic system that offers limited alternatives to theft, prostitution, or starvation. You find yourself walking through the massive iron gates of Saltaire Mill, where the morning sun casts long shadows between towering brick buildings that stretch toward the sky like industrial cathedrals. The air vibrates with a thunderous rhythm of steam-powered machinery, while the acrid smell of coal smoke mingles with something more organic. The sweat and exhaustion of thousands of workers who feed this mechanical beast with their bodies and souls. This is the beating heart of Victorian industrial progress, where human beings become interchangeable components in a vast machine designed to transform raw materials into profit with mechanical efficiency. The factory whistle shrieks across the valley at precisely 6 in the morning, its sound cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a banshee announcing the daily resurrection of industrial capitalism. You watch as streams of workers flow through the gates with the resigned determination of people who understand that their survival depends entirely on maintaining the pace demanded by machines that never tire, never rest, and never acknowledge the humanity of those who serve them. This is where Victorian promises of progress meet the grinding reality of human cost, where the same society that celebrates technological advancement also consumes its own people with a methodical hunger of furnaces burning coal. The factory system represents the triumph of efficiency over empathy, creating wealth for distant shareholders while reducing workers to statistical abstractions in ledger books maintained by men who've never touched a loom or breathed cotton dust. This mainstream Victorian celebration of industrial progress masked systematic exploitation that would make ancient slave masters blush with embarrassment. Factory owners spoke eloquently about providing employment opportunities and building national prosperity while creating working conditions that combined the worst aspects of military discipline with the health hazards of medieval plague cities. The same entrepreneurs who donated generously to charitable causes also operated businesses that shortened their employees' lives with mathematical precision. You enter the main production floor, where the noise hits you like a physical force that makes your bones vibrate and your ears ring with mechanical thunder. Hundreds of power looms operate in perfect synchronization, their steel arms rising and falling with hypnotic rhythm, while workers dart between the machinery like dancers performing a deadly ballet where one misstep means crushed limbs or death. The air fills with cotton fibers that catch the morning light streaming through grimy windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that transforms the industrial floor into something resembling a snow globe filled with microscopic death. Workers breathe this fiber-laden air for 14 hours daily, their lungs gradually filling with the very materials they process until breathing becomes a struggle that ends only with early graves. You observe how the factory system reduces human beings to extensions of mechanical processes, measuring their worth entirely through productivity metrics that ignore everything except output per hour. Workers develop the peculiar efficiency that comes from performing the same motions thousands of times daily, their bodies adapting to serve industrial rhythms rather than human needs. Honestly, you've probably seen more personality in automatic washing machines than these workers are allowed to display during their shifts. The overseer patrols his domain with the satisfied authority of someone who's perfected the art of extracting maximum labor from minimum investment in human welfare. His pocket watch marks time with commercial precision, while his leather strap hangs ready to encourage any worker whose productivity falls below acceptable standards. He speaks about his charges with the same tone that farmers use to discuss livestock, useful assets that require careful management to maintain optimal performance. The lesser-known reality of Victorian factory conditions was how they created new forms of industrial disease that medical science couldn't recognize or treat effectively. Cotton lung, machinery deafness, and repetitive strain injuries became occupational hazards that shortened workers' lives while enriching their employers. Company doctors, when they existed at all, typically diagnosed these conditions as personal weaknesses rather than environmental hazards. You witness the daily rhythm that governs every aspect of factory life, from the precise timing of work breaks to the mechanical regularity of wage payments that barely cover subsistence costs. The system operates with clockwork efficiency, treating human needs as inconvenient variables that must be minimized to maintain profit margins. Workers eat their meager lunches beside the same machines that will eventually kill them, creating a perfect metaphor for industrial capitalism's relationship with human life. The children's workhouse nearby supplies a steady stream of young workers who arrive at the factory gates with the bewildered expressions of people who've discovered that childhood is a luxury they can't afford. These small figures dart between massive machines with the agility that comes from desperation, their tiny hands perfectly suited for tasks that would challenge adult workers. The irony of children operating dangerous machinery while being forbidden to attend school apparently escapes the notice of managers who speak proudly about providing practical education. The economic logic of the factory system reveals Victorian society's fundamental willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for collective prosperity, though the benefits of this prosperity flowed exclusively upward to shareholders and managers who never experienced the conditions they created. Factory owners lived in mansions built with profits extracted from workers' lungs, while their employees occupied overcrowded slums where entire families shared single rooms that lacked basic sanitation. You feel the oppressive weight of constant surveillance as foremen patrol the aisles with the focused attention of prison guards, noting every pause, every conversation, every momentary lapse in attention that might reduce productivity. The workers have learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded glances, developing their own underground language that allows them to maintain some vestige of human connection despite systematic efforts to reduce them to mechanical functions. Historians still debate whether industrialization genuinely improved living standards or simply concentrated existing wealth while creating new forms of poverty and exploitation. Some evidence suggests that factory wages exceeded agricultural income, while other data indicates that industrial working conditions reduced life expectancy and quality of life for entire generations of workers who powered Britain's economic transformation. As evening approaches and the final whistle releases workers from their daily servitude, you realize that the factory system represents Victorian society's most successful experiment in human transformation, not toward enlightenment or progress, but toward the creation of people who've learned to find dignity in degradation and hope in circumstances that offer neither. The soft shuffle of exhausted feet against stone floors creates a rhythm that speaks of endurance rather than triumph, while the dying light filters through windows filmed with industrial dust, casting everything in shades of amber resignation. You find yourself in the opulent library of the Royal Anthropological Institute, where leather-bound volumes line mahogany shelves that stretch toward ornate ceiling frescoes depicting scenes of supposed human evolution. The air carries the familiar scent of old paper and beeswax polish, while afternoon sunlight filters through tall windows to illuminate dust motes that dance like tiny spirits around men who believe they've discovered the scientific laws governing human civilization. This is where Victorian intellectuals transformed Darwin's insights about natural selection into elaborate justifications for everything they already wanted to believe about their own superiority. You settle into a horsehair chair beside Professor Reginald Carruthers, who adjusts his spectacles as he examines a collection of human skulls arranged on his desk like a macabre tea service. Each specimen bears careful measurements and annotations that supposedly reveal the intellectual capacity and moral development of different racial groups, creating a hierarchy of humanity that miraculously places English gentlemen at the apex of evolutionary achievement. The professor speaks with the confident authority of someone who's never questioned whether his measuring tools might be measuring his own prejudices rather than biological reality. This is the world of Victorian racial science, where legitimate scientific methods collide with social prejudices to create theories that sound impressively academic while serving remarkably convenient political purposes. The same men who champion empirical observation and rational analysis somehow produce research that consistently confirms their existing beliefs about white supremacy, male superiority, and class distinctions. Apparently the only coincidence in human history that scientific minds refuse to investigate. This mainstream Victorian embrace of social Darwinism transformed biological concepts into social policies with the enthusiasm of people who've discovered that science can provide moral permission for behavior they intended to pursue anyway. Herbert Spencer's phrase, survival of the fittest, became a rallying cry for everything from imperial conquest to workplace exploitation, as if Darwin's observations about finches automatically justified treating human societies like experimental laboratories for testing evolutionary theories. Professor Carruthers explains his latest research comparing cranial measurements between different populations, apparently convinced that skull capacity directly correlates with intelligence, moral development, and fitness for self-governance. His data reveals precisely what his funding sources expect. Europeans possess larger brains than Africans, men outrank women in intellectual capacity, and the upper classes demonstrate superior cranial development compared to workers. You probably shouldn't mention that his measuring techniques might be slightly less scientific than a Victorian carnival game. The conversation turns to recent anthropological expeditions that have collected specimens from various colonial territories, creating museum displays that present human diversity as evolutionary hierarchy rather than cultural variation. These exhibits arrange different populations according to supposed stages of development, with European civilization representing the pinnacle of human progress, while other societies occupy lower rungs on an evolutionary ladder that leads inevitably toward London drawing rooms. You observe how Victorian racial theories create elaborate intellectual frameworks that transform political domination into scientific necessity. If colonized peoples represent earlier stages of human evolution, then imperial rule becomes a form of benevolent guidance rather than exploitation. The same logic that justifies British control over India also explains why women shouldn't vote and why factory workers deserve lower wages. They're all supposedly less evolved than the gentlemen making these determinations. The lesser-known aspect of Victorian racial science was how it selectively ignored contradictory evidence, while amplifying data that supported predetermined conclusions. Researchers who discovered sophisticated technologies or complex social organizations among non-European peoples typically explain these findings as anomalies or evidence of outside influence, rather than reconsidering their theoretical frameworks. The scientific method apparently worked differently when applied to questions of racial hierarchy. Dr. Pemberton arrives with photographs from recent expeditions to Africa and Asia, images that he interprets as visual proof of evolutionary differences between populations. The photographs show people in various states of dress and activity, but the professor sees confirmation of primitive versus advanced development stages. His analysis reveals more about Victorian assumptions than about the subjects photographed, creating a perfect example of how observation becomes contaminated by expectation. The discussion moves to criminal anthropology, where researchers claim to identify inherited tendencies toward deviant behavior through physical measurements and facial analysis. This pseudoscience suggests that criminal activity results from evolutionary regression rather than social circumstances, providing convenient explanations that avoid examining economic inequality or institutional injustice. Apparently, poverty and crime stem from genetic deficiency rather than systemic problems that might require actual solutions. You notice how social Darwinism provides intellectual justification for policies that Victorian society already pursued for economic and political reasons. Imperial expansion, worker exploitation, and gender restrictions all receive scientific blessing through theories that transform social arrangements into natural laws. The research consistently discovers that existing power structures reflect biological reality rather than historical accident or deliberate design. The library's collection includes works by respected scientists who've dedicated their careers to measuring, classifying, and ranking human populations according to supposed evolutionary advancement. These scholars produce impressive statistical analyses and detailed comparative studies that demonstrate remarkable consistency. Their findings invariably support the social order that employs and honors them. The correlation between research conclusions and researcher benefits apparently requires no investigation. Historians still debate whether Victorian racial scientists genuinely believe their theories or simply provided academic cover for political and economic interests that required scientific legitimacy. Some evidence suggests sincere conviction among researchers who couldn't recognize their own cultural biases, while other documentation reveals calculated efforts to manufacture scientific support for predetermined social policies. As evening approaches and gas lights begin to flicker in the library's reading alcoves, you realize that Victorian racial science represents one of history's most successful attempts to disguise ideology as objective inquiry. The same intellectual methods that revolutionized biology and chemistry somehow produced social theories that confirmed every prejudice held by the people conducting the research, creating a perfect circle of self-reinforcing bias that masqueraded as empirical discovery. The professor carefully returns his skull collection to velvet-lined cases, each specimen labeled with geographic origin and supposed evolutionary significance. These relics of Victorian science will eventually find their way into museum storage rooms, where future generations will study them as examples of how intelligent people can convince themselves that their prejudices represent natural law, transforming temporary social arrangements into eternal truths written in bone and measured in millimeters. You find yourself standing in an elegant drawing room as the final moments of the Victorian era tick away like sand through an hourglass that's been carefully monitored for decades. The air feels different now, thinner somehow, as if the very atmosphere that sustained Victorian certainties has begun to dissipate, like morning fog retreating before the harsh light of a new century. Through tall windows draped in heavy burgundy velvet, you can see the first electric street lamps casting their cold, steady glow across London's ancient cobblestones, their unwavering light so different from the warm, flickering gas flames that have illuminated Victorian nights for generations. The clock on the mantelpiece chimes midnight with a sound that seems to echo through more than just this particular room. It reverberates through an entire worldview that's beginning to crack at its carefully mortared foundations. You feel the shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment when a fever finally breaks and the patient realizes they're going to survive, though they may never be quite the same again. Mrs. Pemberton adjusts her black silk gloves as she surveys the calling cards arranged on her silver tray, each one representing the elaborate social machinery that has governed her life with clockwork precision. But tonight, these rituals feel different, less like natural law and more like theatrical performance, as if someone has suddenly turned on the house lights during the final act of a play that everyone has pretended was real life. This is the slow death of Victorian hypocrisy, not from violent revolution, but from the gradual accumulation of contradictions that have finally grown too heavy for even the most determined moral architecture to support. The same society that built workhouses while preaching Christian charity, that fought opium wars while condemning addiction, that celebrated domestic virtue while exploiting colonial subjects, has discovered that reality has a way of demanding acknowledgement, no matter how elegantly you've arranged your drawing room furniture to hide it. The morning newspapers arrive with stories that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. women demanding votes with the audacity of people who've stopped pretending that political exclusion serves anyone's interests except those doing the excluding. Factory workers organize unions with the disturbing efficiency of people who've realized that their employer's paternal rhetoric never quite extended to paternal wages or working conditions. You observe how the younger generation moves through these familiar spaces with subtly different rhythms. Their conversations touching on subjects that their parents' generation learned to avoid through decades of careful practice. Electric lights illuminate faces that no longer carry the same confident expressions of moral certainty, replaced by something more complex. Perhaps wisdom, perhaps simply exhaustion for maintaining so many beautiful lies for so long. This mainstream Victorian confidence in progress and moral superiority crumbles not through dramatic collapse, but through the slow erosion that occurs when too many people begin asking inconvenient questions about the gap between stated values and actual practices. The same industrial system that created unprecedented wealth also produced unprecedented suffering, a mathematical relationship that becomes harder to ignore when workers develop literacy and newspapers develop independence. The drawing room's carefully arranged perfection suddenly seems less like achievement and more like elaborate stage dressing designed to distract attention from uncomfortable realities. You notice how every beautiful object, the crystal decanters, the leather-bound books, the oil paintings of pastoral scenes, tells stories about extraction, exploitation, and empire that their aesthetic beauty has been carefully designed to obscure. Scientific discoveries that once seemed to confirm Victorian theories about racial hierarchy and social evolution now provide evidence for conclusions that make educated gentlemen distinctly uncomfortable. Darwin's actual writings, as opposed to their convenient misinterpretations, suggest that humans share more similarities than differences, while archaeological discoveries reveal sophisticated civilizations in places that Imperial maps label as backward territories requiring European guidance. The lesser-known aspect of Victorian decline was how quickly seemingly permanent institutions began to feel provisional once people stopped believing in their inevitability. Domestic service arrangements that had seemed natural for generations suddenly appeared arbitrary when servants realized they possessed skills that qualified them for different kinds of work. Imperial administrations that had operated smoothly for decades encountered increasing resistance from colonized peoples who developed inconvenient ideas about self-governance. You feel the weight of accumulated moral debt as the bills for Victorian prosperity finally come due in forms that can't be paid with rhetoric about civilization and progress. The children who worked in factories grow up to vote. The women who maintain domestic perfection begin demanding public roles. And the colonized peoples who supplied raw materials start insisting on processing their own resources for their own benefit. The transformation occurs not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of water wearing away stone. Each small crack in Victorian certainty allows a little more light to enter, revealing the elaborate mechanisms that have sustained moral contradictions for so long. You probably wouldn't recognize the world that's emerging from these ruins, but then again, the Victorians wouldn't have recognized their own era from the perspective of those who came before them. Evening brings conversations that would have scandalized earlier generations. Frank discussions about poverty's causes, honest acknowledgments of imperial brutality, and open questions about whether moral progress actually requires the kind of economic arrangements that Victorian society has treated as sacred law. The comfortable certainties that once seemed as permanent as London's fog are dissipating with equally mysterious inevitability. Historians still debate whether the end of the Victorian era represented genuine moral evolution or simply the replacement of one set of hypocrisies with another, more modern collection of beautiful lies. Perhaps each generation must discover its own forms of self-deception before gradually learning to see through them, creating an endless cycle of progress and backsliding that defines human development across centuries. As the night deepens and the electric lights burn steadily, without the romantic flicker of gas flames, you realize that Victorian society is experiencing something more complex than simple decline. It's discovering that moral evolution requires periodic molting, the painful process of growing out of ideas that once fit perfectly but have become constraining rather than protective. The world outside continues turning, carrying these beautiful, hypocritical contradictions toward a future that will judge them with the same mixture of fascination and horror that Victorians themselves directed toward medieval practices they considered barbaric. History moves forward like a great wheel, grinding hypocrisies into dust while creating new ones that future generations will struggle to understand and overcome in their own time. And now, as our journey through the Victorian world of beautiful contradictions draws to its close, you can feel your breathing naturally slowing, deepening, as the weight of all these stories settles gently around you like a soft blanket woven from the threads of human experience. The clock continues its quiet marking of time, each tick a small reminder that all eras eventually pass, that all certainties eventually give way to new questions, and that perhaps the greatest wisdom lies not in finding perfect answers, but in learning to ask better questions. With each generation, each lifetime, each quiet moment of reflection, as you settle more deeply into this peaceful state, you can almost hear the whisper of history itself, flowing like a gentle river that carries away even the most elaborate pretenses, leaving only the eternal human questions that each of us must answer for ourselves, in our own time, in our own way, with whatever wisdom we can gather along the journey. The Victorian age breathes its last, and something new, something different, something perhaps a little more honest, begins to stir in the shadows of a changing world. While you drift peacefully, safely, into the gentle embrace of sleep, where dreams carry no contradictions, and rest comes without the burden of maintaining perfect appearances. Sleep well, dear listener. May your dreams be filled with the wisdom that comes from understanding the past, and the hope that comes from knowing that human beings can learn, can grow, can become better than they were, one beautiful, imperfect step at a time, in the soft, warm darkness of peaceful rest.